It's very hard to believe this is 6 months. That was 6 months into the war. Uh, I was on radio in England this morning, and I was afraid of what I was going to say. What would they ask me, and how could I respond that wouldn't be problematic? Luckily, they asked me mostly about the hostages, so it was relatively easy. But it's really hard to talk about the war 6 months in at this point. As you can see from my background, I'm in New York at the moment. I'm coming back to Israel on Tuesday, but mostly to visit family, but also given a number of lectures over the last few days. There's no easy way to say this, but it's quite clear at this point that the war has been a disaster, frankly. We lost the war on the first day of the war, and everything since has been an attempt to make things better. And the reality is the only thing that would have made things better is getting the hostages back, and we haven't, which is more than a little problematic, to say the least. The fact that they hate us, well, we learned that before. We learned that on the 7th of October. We also learned that they hate us in the rest of the world on the 8th of October, the 9th of October. It didn't wait for events that have taken place in Gaza since for the people to start demonstrating and talking about from the river to the sea, which, to say the least, is problematic. As of this morning, we pulled our troops out of Khan Yunis after being there for 4 months. When they talked about going into Khan Yunis initially, they talked about maybe a month. And then I can remember day after day, the military correspondents, almost a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And of course, a little bit more ended up being 4 months altogether. And tragically, yesterday, 4 soldiers were killed in Khan Yunis, basically patrolling in order to keep the supply lines open to the troops in Khan Yunis. When you're there, you're a target, and that, of course, is a problem in and of itself. We have, quote unquote, the humanitarian disaster that's going on. I am still one who does not believe the disaster is nearly as bad as what's being made out to be. Doesn't mean it's good, but it's not as bad as the propagandists are making it out to be, and they've worked very hard at making it seem like everyone is starving in Gaza. It's a very problematic situation because all the reporting agencies, there's no independent reporting agencies. It's all based on reporting by the Palestinians themselves, Palestinian UNRWA workers. It's all a closed loop, so to speak. So it's created, more than a PR nightmare, just a nightmare overall. And there are no good solutions. That's the reality. Part of it is we brought on ourselves. I think if you all can remember my writings, and before we went in terms of the ground operation, I believe I wrote very clearly that we cannot start a ground operation without a political plan for the day after. You need a plan. You can't have a military operation that doesn't combine some sort of plan for what's going to be the day after. For his political reasons, his inability to keep his government together, Netanyahu has never been willing to come up with a plan for the day after. Forget come up with a plan. There hasn't been a serious discussion on the cabinet level of what should be the day after. We're now 6 months into a war with no political goals. And there's no such thing as a war without a political goal. Clausewitz's old statement that war is an extension of politics by other means. And don't hold me on the exact wording, but that's what he said. And we have a war without a political goal. Destroying Hamas is very nice, but what does that mean? And clearly, it's almost impossible to actually destroy Hamas. You can hurt them, you can degrade them, but it's almost impossible to destroy them. You could replace them maybe, but unless you have something to replace them with, you can't end their control of Gaza, and we haven't done anything to ensure there's something to replace them with. Without that, there is no solution, and so we're stuck in the situation at this point. And more than anything else, we have hostages still there. And how many of them are alive? No one knows. Yesterday we retrieved the body of a hostage, and I don't even like the term. We the word that um, we freed the hostage. We didn't free the hostage. We retrieved his body. He was dead, unfortunately, and we don't know how many more are dead. Um, I'm sure way too many are dead, and I have my doubts whether any of the women hostages will ever be released because of what they've no doubt done to them. They'll never want that reported. So it's not a good situation in terms of that. In the meantime, we pulled out this morning. There were rocket attacks on the communities right around the Gaza border. They don't have the rockets, at least at the moment, to fire long distance to Tel Aviv, to other areas. I don't think there's been an attack in Tel Aviv in over 2 months. But the communities right around the border are still getting attacks from areas that we haven't been to previously. We have great statistics, how many rockets how many rockets we intercepted, how many rockets we destroyed. And that part is true. It's worked, and the number of rocket attacks is relatively small at this point. But we haven't eliminated Hamas, and I don't think we will at this point. And then we kept up north. The northern border, we have created a security zone on our side of the border, which is absurd. I think during those first few days of the war, there was panic. And so it was easier to remove the people from their homes and send them to hotels and not worry about it. But it was a mistake. If we look at it retroactively, it clearly was a mistake to clear the area and therefore to basically say to Hezbollah, you can attack because you're not going to be killing any Israeli civilians, which means we're not going to attack that vigorously against you, which is what's happened more or less with small events in between. So the North has no easy solution unless there's a solution on the South, at which point Hezbollah will stop fighting. But we will not have eliminated, obviously, the Hezbollah threat. I think I've said it before, and I believe it even more strongly today. We do not want to go to war with Hezbollah until we are able to deploy our laser defense system. We just don't want to deal with the number of, whether it's casualties or just physical damage. Without the lasers, yes, we can defend against most of the missiles, but clearly not all of them. And we could be in a situation that would not be the situation we'd like to be in, to say the least. So, and then of course there's Iran. Iran has really always been our biggest threat. It's the one threat that's, as much as the Gaza attack was considered endangering the state, it really wasn't. It was a terrible event, without a shadow of a doubt, without a question. However, the Iran threat is very real. Not at the moment. I mean, yes, it's very real. They're going to probably there's a good chance they'll try to send a series of missiles and drones, and they will try to attack some military target of significance. Will any of them get through? I don't know. We have very effective missile defense systems. We seem to have a less effective drone defense system. But hopefully, by the fact that we're at the highest level of readiness, we'll succeed in downing the drones as they approach. We did not learn the lessons of the Ukraine war, I'm afraid. Well, certainly not in time, and not realize that massive numbers of drones are one of the ways that our adversaries could try to project a war. Certainly, the Iranians have certainly provided the Russians with large numbers of drones. So they must have, a similar number for themselves. What their ranges are, where they can shoot from, it varies greatly. We've been working on better interception and better detection of drones. It's a little bit complicated because it's hard to detect a drone versus a bird, and it requires a system that includes both acoustic and radar. And we have such systems, and we're trying to deploy them. Hopefully, they'll be effective. but it requires innovation and speed in terms of implementing all sorts of ideas. Um, so we'll have to see what, Israel's sitting in sort of waiting for the Iranian response. Part of their psychological warfare is clearly making us wait. The longer they hold off, the more they can drive Israelis crazy. Once they actually do it, it'll be done and over with. And then the question, Israel will have to decide whether it wants to retaliate for their retaliation and whether we're going to get drawn into a back and forth between us and the Iranians. But it's unclear. It's unclear. If they're not successful, I doubt we will retaliate. If they are successful, we may retaliate, and that will create its own set of problems. We still have the Houthis. They seem to be, although like they claim today they attacked 2 Israeli ships in the Red Sea. I doubt that's true. Their definition of an Israeli ship is very, very, very loose. If 5% of the company that holds the ship is owned by some Israeli, it becomes an Israeli ship. I doubt they attacked any Zim ships or Israeli flag flying ships. They've stayed away from the area completely. Zim has been basically uh, sending their ships around the Horn of Africa and has not been sending their ships anywhere near the Houthis for obvious reasons. So that's where we stand with that. Where do we stand otherwise in the world? Clearly, after being here for a little over a week, talking to people, clearly the issue of anti-Semitism is very, very real. It seems almost organized in the sense on the left side. The anti-Israel from the river to the sea, calling every Jew a Zionist, that started not now, not after our response, but started literally, day one. And so I don't say it was planned in advance, but it was ready to go from day one. And look, I don't know that there's easy solutions to that also. If you look at the junior faculty at so many Ivy League colleges and other colleges, you won't find too many white Jewish boys, shall we say, even Jewish women, but you won't see very many of them on the junior faculty of any of these colleges. You'll see many more of all sorts of ethnic descents and a significant number of Palestinians and other Muslims on the junior faculty of so many of these schools, whether they're Columbia or Harvard or any of these places. I'm not one against ethnic diversity, but I think it's not worked in our favor when it comes to what's going on the university campuses. I mean, it's not only the faculty, obviously, it's the students as well. It's the students who are organized. It's much easier to be organized against um, against Israel in the sense to know what you want to do from the river to the sea and easy slogans than it is to do the counter. And explaining Israel is more complicated than saying, well, we want to destroy Israel. And it's not an easy task. And we do not have people equipped to deal with it, to be honest. I've said this before. Israel has made a major mistake, and American juries made a major mistake. Israel has never put the effort necessary in terms of education in America. I've always been saying that. But I think at this point, I would give up on Israel doing it. And I say again, American Jews should stop giving money to Israel and should spend all that money in America on Israel/Jewish education. I don't mean educating day schools. That's a different story altogether. I'm talking about straight education on the conflict, on Israel, on Jewish right to exist, period, in the world. All of these things. We should be spending time and effort. And frankly, a little less Holocaust education. I don't think the Holocaust education achieves what its goal has been all along. It doesn't stop anyone from being an anti-Semitic just because there was a Holocaust. Or anti-Israel. I don't think it hasn't worked quite honestly. So it requires some serious thinking. And I'm afraid there are too many interest groups who are interested in the status quo in different ways that I fear there will not be the sort of self-examination of what we've done and what we're doing in order to achieve that. In Israel at the moment, I mean, last night was the largest demonstration since the beginning of the war. There was a ramming attack, wasn't quite hit and run because he didn't quite run away, but there was somebody who obviously opposed the demonstrators who rammed and ran over a number of demonstrators. One is still in serious condition, three more in light condition. Um, there is this the divide has returned primarily pushed, unfortunately, by the Likud spokesman who keeps on claiming they want to kill Netanyahu. That has been the line for the last 3 days because one person threw a torch, mind you, a torch was thrown at a demonstration in Jerusalem. I guess it was last Monday night or Tuesday night. So suddenly they want to kill Netanyahu. Netanyahu is having a special meeting of tomorrow with Itamar Ben-Gvir and a couple of other um, wonderful people to discuss the threats against government officials by, I don't know, the left or whoever it might be. Um, you know, sometimes it's sort of like Trump who sees what he wants to say and claims the other side. That's clearly the case here. Yes, people don't like Netanyahu, but I don't think I've heard anyone, call for killing Netanyahu. And people would be happy if he, obviously if he resigned, if he disappeared from public life, but I've never heard anyone literally call to kill Netanyahu on the left at any point in the last all these years, to be honest with you. But it's created new fissures in the society quite clearly. Quite clearly, they managed to divide the families of the hostages between those who are more critical of the government and those who are less critical of the government. It's not clear, ultimately it's Hamas who doesn't want a deal. And whatever we can say about the government doing a good or bad job negotiating or being flexible enough, it's not clear if they were more flexible, we'd get a deal. They probably should be more flexible, but it doesn't necessarily mean there would be a deal just because the Israeli government became more flexible tomorrow. And they're pretty willing to go fairly far. Hamas has no real interest in a deal because the hostages are their insurance policy. And I don't, they kept Gilad Shalit for 5 years. They've been keeping the two bodies from the 2014 war, plus the two additional people who somehow wandered into Gaza or whatever their stories are, two live and two dead Israelis now for all these years. And nothing has convinced them to give them up during this whole period of time because they consider those important bargaining chips. So I don't know. We're going to, when we can get these hostages back and how. Clearly, militarily, we failed. And that's, need to understand there's no total victory without the hostages. And, what total victory means, I'll be damned if I have any idea. Netanyahu said, we're just a little bit, an itsy bitsy bit away from total victory. I've often said in the last 6 months that some of the briefings I've heard remind me of the 5 o'clock follies in Vietnam. A few of you are old enough to remember what the 5 o'clock follies were. That was the daily briefing that was given during the Vietnam War about how many Vietnamese we killed today and how many bombing runs we did and all those sort of things. I'll have in today's update the statistics that were released by the Army spokesman today on 6 months. And some of the statistics are quite interesting. But basically, that's what it amounts to. These are all the things that we've done. But what impact they've all had on the other side, it's a big question. And Hamas is still operating quite clearly. So, it's depressing. I don't have any other way of describing the situation at the moment but to say it's depressing. Uh, every time I've spoken in the last couple of days, people ask, well, can you tell me something optimistic? People want, everyone wants some optimism. My only optimism that I can share is the hope that what's happened has been traumatic enough that we will have a new generation of leaders to take control of the country. I don't know if it'll work. The current leaders, and I don't only mean just Netanyahu, I mean the whole political leadership, no one wants to give up their power. No one gives up power readily and easily. But we need a complete shift. And the shift is not to go from Netanyahu to Gantz. I mean, I'm not against guns per se, but that's not the sort of shift we need. We need a much more radical shift in terms of leaders, in terms of who they are, who they represent, what parts of society they come from. It's enough having our leaders at the moment come from two, with a few exceptions, obviously, there's always exceptions, but they're either lifetime um, political hacks, basically, who got involved in politics from the time they were in college, if they went to college, but got involved in all along. That's especially true of the Likud, or they're former army people of one kind or another. There are exceptions, obviously, but we need a different type of people to become involved in politics in Israel, to become part of the leadership in Israel. How we get there, I don't know, but we need it desperately. We need a different, we need a plan for the future. And it's very difficult. It's very difficult to have a plan for the future when you don't really have a plan for how, it's impossible to have a plan, to be honest with you, how you reach some sort of peace agreement with your most immediate neighbors, because they don't want really a peace agreement. And I think that's one of the things that's clear from all that's taken place in the last six 6 months, is that we may have parts of us who want peace. We have some parts that don't want peace, but most of us want peace in some form or another. But I fear that, it takes two to tango, it takes two to make peace. And if too many of them still believe that we're temporarily, we're the crusaders, they can outlast us, they can outlive us, and eventually we'll be gone, then what's the incentive to make peace with us? And I fear that's very prevalent these days amongst the Palestinians, which makes coming to peace with them a very, very difficult challenge, to say the least. The days I sympathize with the right wing position, other than the fact that most of it's immoral. So it's a little bit of a problem. But I can sympathize. You know, they don't want peace, they'll never want peace, therefore we have to act like they never want peace. But we still have to hope. We still have to hope that, if not in our generation, in the generation of our grandkids, there'll be a possibility to reach peace. And I say grandkids, I don't even say kids at this point, because I'm not optimistic. I'm certainly not, I've given up on our generation. I mean, my generation. Some of you, I'm sure, are younger on this, but a lot of you are of my generation, give or take. And I don't think we're going to see peace in our generation. I would hope in our children's generation, but I'm not optimistic about that either. So we need to find a way of surviving and finding a way that will lead us to a chance of peace at some point. And I don't know what that is. I truly don't know what it is. If I knew, I would say, I would do. I just don't know. And that's, of course, the most depressing part of it all, right? In other words, and not knowing what what can be done or how it can be done is ultimately very depressing. I can write about it all day and night. I can talk about it all day and night. But to bring about a real change, I don't know how to do that. I don't know, and I don't think any of us really do. Anyone who claims they know, don't, take them with a big grain of salt, because I don't think anyone really knows at this point. Look, one of the only things I can say positive, which is not really positive, but it has the possibility of positive in it, is the world is in such chaos in different ways that sometimes in chaos, the cards get dealt a little bit differently and things change. And maybe the directions we think things are going in will change. And maybe geopolitics will change, and maybe religion will become less important, which is, by the way, a key factor in reaching peace, because as long as everyone is sure their own religion is the right religion, whether it's Muslim, Jews, or anyone else, then it's very, very hard to reach peace, unless people understand the difference between these religions is so minor that it's absurd that we fight each other. But we'll leave that part aside. But if people get less nationalistic, less religious, less etc., maybe there'll be a chance, a different chance of reaching some sort of peace. But there's no assurance that that's going to happen. It's unclear with the turmoil that exists today, how that happens and in which ways that happens. On that optimistic note, I will open up for questions, because I don't really have much more to say, and where we stand, but I'll be happy to answer any questions that people might have. So just do the, the hands up or whatever that is, and hopefully I'll see it. I don't have my wife in the same place where she would yell and say it's someone put up their hand. So bear with me if I don't see you right away. Well, she's online, but she's not in the same room. So, uh, Howard, Howard.
Yes, yes, yes. I just want to get my camera on.
Okay.
Um, well, I don't know. My camera is not on
Well, your
for
voice
some
is
reason.
good.
Oh, there it is. Okay. Um, Mark, I came on a couple of minutes late, so I don't know if you talked about this, but it certainly seems like the the killing of the aid workers last week was a kind of turning point, um, in a very unfortunate way. Uh, and it has all kinds of implications. And I guess the implication that has been on my mind, and I'm wondering how you're looking at this, is excuse me, is domestic, is American, is diasporic. Um, the impact that the that incident had was sort of incrementally uh, layered on top of many other things that have happened over the last 6 months, and has, I think, the potential for very damaging political impact here in the U.S. Um, the the feeling in domestic politics here and on the Democratic side has become very tenuous. And I don't know where this is going to go, but the fear that I have, and I know I'm not alone, is that this has the potential to increase the likelihood that we are going to see Donald Trump reelected, um, or elected again. And that will have enormously negative consequences around the world and certainly for Israel. And
Okay.
so I wonder if, how do
Okay.
you see this dynamic?
Okay. So let's take this apart first of all. Um, part one is the question: will this affect Donald Trump becoming president? I don't really think so. I mean, I've had this argument um, for a while now about what's going on in Michigan. Will they vote, not vote? Will they not come out to vote because of Biden's position on Israel? I think two things relating to that. Number one, I have to believe this is going to be over a couple of months before the November. I mean, I have to believe it. I don't know if it's true, but a couple of months before the November election. Once it's over, I don't think it'll have that great of an impact. The history of foreign policy impacting an American presidential election is almost zero. There was some impact with George Bush, um, the junior, I guess, but very little impact has been over a period of time in the reality of an American presidential election. Do I think Donald Trump will be a disaster for Israel? Yes, he will be. And the Jews don't understand that. And it has nothing to do with his position on Israel. It has to do with the position of America in the world. And if America in the world um, gets weakened, that weakens Israel quite clearly. Now, to go back to the specifics of the what happened to the aid workers, yes, I think it was a turning point in a negative sense. People understood that immediately. Um, because it sort of coalesced a lot of views of Israel just not caring enough or not being careful enough and all of those things. Now, did it change any real views? I mean, look, the people who claimed Israel was creating genocide or was had a policy of starvation, both of which were absurd. Genocide obviously is clearly not the case. Genocide would be if Israel just carpet bombed all of Gaza and to kill all the Palestinians. That would be genocide, which obviously it's not doing in any which way. I also don't believe, whatever the state of hunger or lack of hunger in Gaza at the moment, and I have I do not believe people are as hungry um, as um, as people have made it out to be. but there are people who have certainly food insecurity, to say the least. Um, but the reality is, those people who are claiming that Israel has a policy of starvation, I mean, that's absurd. People don't understand how incompetent Israel can be often. And often an explanation of what's happened is often Israel's incompetency as opposed to its plan to do. I mean, we go back to the very beginning of what I said. Israel never had a plan. Its plan was to destroy Hamas and to retrieve the hostages. Well, those are very nice, it's like apple pie, right? I mean, we all wanted to see Hamas destroyed, we all wanted to receive the hostages back. But did it have a strategic plan that really reflected that? I have my questions, I mean, from a military standpoint, if we wanted to get the hostages started in Rafah and moved north. That way we would make sure the hostages didn't keep on moving away from us. But that wasn't the policy for whatever reasons, and I'm not going to, I'm not going to question the military decisions. Maybe there was the right military decision. I don't know, but it was not the right political decision in terms of achieving the political goals. So often, the terrible things that are attributed to Israel are really incompetency. We have, and this is the most important thing people have to keep in mind, not the most important, but one of the important things. Leaving aside the politics of our current government, put that totally aside, whether you agree or disagree with the politics, it's incompetent. It's an incompetent government with very few ministers who are competent to do their jobs. I mean, it's a long-term problem with Israel has always had, the nature of the system. I mean, we switched the Minister of Energy with the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the middle of a war. Now, neither of them are particularly competent, but still, let's just assume that one of them was learning his job after being on it for a year. Why would you possibly switch it out because you have a political agreement to, make this other person foreign minister because he wanted to be foreign minister and he thought that was more prestigious? That makes no logical sense. But we did it anyway because that's the system we have, and that's Netanyahu trying to keep everyone happy. So often, what people attribute to terrible aims or terrible goals, it's not. We're not trying to starve the people in Gaza. Are we doing enough? That's a whole other question. Could we do more? No doubt we could do more, but we're not trying to starve anybody. We're just incompetent in trying to get the food in, or we're not willing to risk our troops to distribute the food. I remember a well-known Israeli military commentator making a statement. This is probably 3 or 4 months ago. And he said, would you want to be the person telling an Israeli parent that their son or daughter was killed while trying to distribute food in Gaza? Now, on some levels, I would say yes, because maybe it's more important than killing some more Hamas people. On the other hand, I certainly wouldn't want to be that person. I certainly don't want to risk someone's life to feed some Gazan because of what's happened. So I don't think I've really answered it, other than to say it's much more complicated than people make it out to be. And I think, yes, we need to worry about Donald Trump and we need to worry about, but I don't think this really is going to have the impact that people are afraid of. Again, come back and we can talk again in October. And if I'm wrong and the war's still going on, who knows? But I don't think so. And I think ultimately, to go back to the very beginning, that Palestinian sitting in Michigan who has to decide between a binary choice, because it's going to be a binary choice between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. I think he's going to vote for Joe Biden and not Donald Trump because of all the other policies that Donald Trump represents, even in this area.
That's possible. If you don't mind, that just a follow-up, I guess. That voter in Michigan could vote for Robert Kennedy or not vote at all.
Yes, of course.
That's possible.
It's possible, and I hope everyone, enough effort is made to make it clear that voting for any of those two people, well, it's not quite clear for sure who Robert Kennedy hurts the more. That's an open question, but
I know.
But voting for a third party candidate probably helps Trump more than it helps Biden, because Trump has never gotten beyond 45% of the vote. So the answer is yes.
Yeah.
I hope the Democrats manage to get that message across, far and wide. All the people who voted for Ralph Nader once upon a time, I guarantee you, I hope that 98% of them are sorry about that. That was
I hope so. I hope you're right.
So.
The other point that I wanted to make, to go back to the event that took place last week with the aid workers, in the readout that you put in your post from the military, when you look closely at that, it clarifies something that's been evident for a while, which is a policy, a kind of a military policy, which identifies or at least potentially identifies a Hamas gunman in a group of 20 people, and then targets that Hamas gunman. And the readouts, the 5 o'clock follies that you refer to, which I remember vividly, always had very similar sorts of language in it, and would say that we eliminated 10 Viet Cong. And there may have been 100 civilians around the 10 Viet Cong, but they were killed as well. And I think what happened last week, for me certainly, and I'm quite certain for others, is that that aspect of the policy became much clearer. And it's, as we go through this week after week and month after month, it becomes almost intolerable to read, because you understand that the one gunman, potentially a Hamas operative, was eliminated, probably means that 20 or 30 or 40 others were killed who had nothing to do with it. And it's just become very, very difficult to see that every day.
Okay, keep in mind,
and I guess that's pretty much all I could say about it.
Right, but this may be true in this case, and I think there's probably more to the story than we know. But maybe at some point in history we'll find out. And it wasn't something that I think the government or the army planned on. So don't think I'm going down that conspiracy route. But leave that aside. Look, the numbers don't really indicate that. If you take Hamas's numbers of 40,000 at this point, people killed, assume that it's exaggerated to some extent. So let's say that 30,000 who were killed, which is still a large number, and 12,000 were fighters. So you have a ratio of 1 to 2 point something or another, not 1 to 10 or 1 to 20. Again, every civilian killed is terrible, but one of the things that Israelis don't realize, and all the people who defend Israel, and I consider myself one of them, but don't realize, we're living in a different environment. We're living in an environment where, between cell phones and TikTok and all the methods of social media, how many videos did anyone see of Iraqi civilians being killed by American bombs? Every once in a while there'll be something will come through from a television correspondent who happened to be in the right place. But generally speaking, the answer was none. Not to mention Afghanistan, or go back into history to any wars going back in Vietnam, for instance, what you just described. There were no cell phones, there were no cameras there. The guy would give those numbers, and there'll be no terrible pictures that came out of all of the Vietnamese civilians that were killed. So yes, it's a really problem, and we're living in an information age. And one of my biggest complaints against the IDF and the Israeli government is the fact that they believe that they're fighting a war, and a just war. And there are two problems. Number one, it's a just war. We're right, but being right doesn't make you smart. So that's problem number one. We need to realize that just being right is not a good enough plan. Problem number two is we are fighting a kinetic war. But warfare today is multidimensional and includes an information war. And you don't win an information war just because you have a spokesman who is able to speak in English and explain what you do. You have to actually do things in order to win an information war. So my best example I've given before is when the issue of whether Palestinians were being stopped from giving birth came up and was part of the Hague proceedings. I thought we should set up a maternity hospital in Gaza. I don't know if anyone would have come, but we should have had a maternity hospital and said, look, we have a maternity hospital. Does anyone want to come? We can't make them come, but we set it up. This claim is completely nonsensical. The claim was nonsensical to begin with, right? I mean, of all the claims against us, we weren't trying to stop Palestinians from giving birth, obviously. But we needed to it was more than just to say we weren't. We needed to do something proactive to show that we weren't. And still wouldn't have stopped people from attacking us, and still wouldn't stop people from calling from the river to the sea, and still wouldn't, stop people from accusing us of war crimes. But it might work, at least in the middle. It might affect some of the people. You need to be proactive. When you're fighting an information war, it's more than just explaining yourself. You have to do things proactively so that people see what you're doing and see that we're doing things on a positive positive plane, not just, explain why we're doing X, Y, and Z. Okay, anyone else? Okay. Nobody out there? Okay. Brock.
Watched. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just watched a really uh, depressing podcast, so I thought I should share it.
You want to share
the,
more depression? Okay, right ahead.
yeah.
Give
That
some
goes
Xanax out. Give some Xanax out with your depressing podcast, please.
that goes along with your pessimistic attitude, which I think is an accurate one. Uh, one of the things that it's caused me to obsess about this war is that I think it's so closely linked to the United States also. I think that Israel's problems are to a large extent, not completely, but I mean, it's obviously a very different country. But I think Western culture as a whole is having problems. And the claim was that there's, it may be the case that the West will never win another war because you can't, we live in a fallen world. I mean, reality is ugly. And there's always people willing to do really horrific things to win a war. And if you, and if Western governments are held hostage to people phoning with their iPhones, things that really look horrible. And sometimes they really look horrible because they really are horrible because war is horrible. And it's unjust and it's disgusting and it's filthy. And I don't know if we are able to deal with that anymore.
I think,
But Hamas sure as hell is.
right. I mean, I think that's very true. I mean, war is a terrible thing, period. There's no two ways around it. And you're right. War has terrible consequences for the innocents, wherever they may be, because war is not, I mean, okay, things like the Yom Kippur War, which were fought in the desert between tanks, that's one thing. But certainly an urban war is a terrible thing. Look, we see it also obviously between Russia and Ukraine. And there you have a situation again where the Russians don't care what they do. Whatever war crimes the Russians commit, they don't care. They're already sanctioned. The world already hates them. So Putin is showing he's strong by killing Ukrainians, killing Ukrainian civilians, and hoping that Donald Trump is elected. So yes, war is terrible. It's hard for a Western country to win the information war. It's clearly almost impossible. And I don't know what this, there is no easy solution. Israel is particularly in a particular bind because, look, even going back to the War of Independence, there were more foreign correspondents in Israel in the time of the War of Independence than any other place in the world during that period of time. And so, you think about it, we've always been the center of interest of the whole world, and for better or for worse. And that's always been a real problem. And yes, we're looked upon with a microscope, and we need to understand that, and we can make all the claims we want. Look what happened here, look what happened there, look how many were killed in the Congo, look how many were killed in all these places. But we're held to a different standard for better or for worse. And so, yes, it's very difficult for the West, and it's particularly difficult for Israel. And again, going back to what we saw, the demonstrations against Israel, I would sort of understand them if they happened 4 or 5 weeks into the war after we began our ground assault campaign and we started, a significant number of Palestinians were getting killed, whether they were civilians or not civilians. It not that important in this particular case when you look at it. But the demonstrations began on October 8th, the day after we were massacred, and people started demonstrating on behalf of the Palestinians. How do you explain that? There's no easy way to explain that. So that's, yes, It's depressing, but we have no choice, really. That's the bottom line. I've been, Theo.
Hi. This is actually one of the first things you said, but it ties in with what you just said. That we don't trust the figures that come out of the Palestinian Authority. We don't trust the figures that come out of Hamas. We don't trust the figures that come out of UNRWA, and we don't trust the figures that come out of the Red Cross because they're interlinked with the Red Crescent. But we don't trust the figures that come out of Doctors Without Borders. We probably will never trust anything that World Central Kitchen says about us again after this incident. But I do think, and it's always been the case, I can remember living in the North and we called the force in Lebanon UNIFIL. And so Israel has always been able to, largely quite rightly so, demonize the international agencies and forces that have encircled it, that have monitored it and such. But I think the expansion of that suspicion into every aid organization that has worked in Gaza, to try to repair what we've done and to try to help feed people, medicate people, resurrect, allows Netanyahu to be further entrenched. And Israel, I'm sure you could come up with more examples of what Israel has done, and Netanyahu all the more so, to alienate Israel, to show Israel as alienated, such that he does not have to abide by international norms, because the entire international world, including the do-gooders, are against Israel. And therefore, he doesn't really have to recognize Gazan civilians or their voice as represented through these aid organizations, because their numbers are wrong and they're lying and their videos are doctored. And so we can call into question anything that might otherwise be thought of as really horrible and human by doing that.
Two things I have to say about that. Look, one of the problems with a lot of these organizations and the numbers, and the reason we question them, is who's producing these numbers all together. In other words, are they being produced by independent observers counting bodies, or the equivalent, or independent observers, non-Palestinian observers going around and seeing how much food are in these different places? And so that immediately, the fact that this information is coming from Palestinian sources, or which in Gaza means Hamas sources, brings it all into question. I don't think it's helping Netanyahu per se. It is hurting, it is making it easier for Israelis to look the other way, quite clearly. It's easier for the fact that on our televisions, we don't really show most of these images. Now, the reality is Israelis, are still living in October 7th. This is what people don't understand. We have not moved past October 7th, especially because we have the hostages still there. We interview, hostage families on TV all the time. We hear their stories. We are still living in the trauma of October 7th, and therefore we don't have the room for the empathy that maybe we should have, or maybe we shouldn't have, for all these Palestinians that are suffering. And when we see a poll that shows that 80% support what Hamas did, even though it may be false, and maybe they're just afraid to say it, we don't know, but you see those polls and you say, aha, look, they all support what they did to us, so therefore why should we care? So I don't think it's so much Netanyahu in this case, but I think it's the attitude that makes it very, very difficult. And, it's when you're hurting, it's really difficult to have the empathy for the other person who may be hurting, especially when you didn't start it. It's hard. It really is. You want to have the empathy. We're humans. We should have empathy for all humans. But on the other hand, when you think about it, the people who are, so many of the people who were killed on that day were the people who were most involved in the peace movement along the Gaza border, who were most involved in taking Palestinians and bringing them to hospitals in Israel, who were most in favor of a two-state solution. And those were the people who were killed and burned alive and everything else. And therefore you have to ask, how much humanity are we supposed to have? For how long? And it's not a simple solution. Claude, I've been told I've missed you a couple of times. I don't know if you're still there.
It starts, the PR issue has been grave for a long time. It starts with a guy named Renan Gissim, who during the Intifada would get on American televisions and yelling about the Intifada, and then newscasters would cut over to a Palestinian female newscaster who would then speak quietly and nicely and so on and so forth. I mean, even during the Intifada, Israel was losing the PR. Not very dissimilar from from Rumsfeld, if you remember us destroying the country of Iraq for no apparent reason.
Right,
So I was just wondering why Israel, with all its technology, can't figure out, maybe you know it since you're in the PR world, how to create a better PR envelope.
Okay, so there are two reasons, in my opinion. It goes back from the very beginning. I remember before I first moved to Israel, but I was working for the Jewish agency. Back then, I used to say, why are we not spending more money on PR? After all, the United States gives, back then, I think it was giving approximately $2 billion in aid. And what does any government, excuse me, any business that has $2 billion in income, what do? They spend at least 5% of their income on marketing and sales. Well, we were spending about $1 million a year for all the PR efforts in the United States, and that included probably the salaries of the consul generals or whatever. So the reality is we never were spending the kind of money necessary. Israelis never thought it was necessary. They always knew better. And we have the most, the poorest people. Why was Netanyahu so popular in Israel for so long? And a lot of it has to do with the fact that he was one of the few people in the government who spoke English the way he did. And so people said, oh, look at him. Look how wonderful he speaks English. He must be good for us because he speaks English so well. Well, leaving aside Netanyahu, in the current government, I can't think of, Ron Dermer, of course, is in the government, but he doesn't speak at all. I mean, he's never been interviewed even once by Israeli TV, and he was interviewed once by some American. I have no idea how he speaks, but I don't think on the fact that his English is his native language. He's a Republican operative. That's where he comes from. That's the world he comes from. So we don't even have any decent spokesmen in terms of just ability to speak well. Forget the ability to convince or anything else. B, we just don't spend the money and the time and the effort. And also understand that PR for Israel is not PR. It's education. It's long-term education. It's things that need to be done, not from today to tomorrow, but need to be planned today over the next 10 years. And that's why I'm strongly in favor of American Jews taking it upon themselves to do it, because I don't think the Israeli government is capable of doing it. The Israeli government is, go back to what I said earlier. Incompetency is the major problem that Israel has when it comes to its government. It's certainly when it comes to long-term planning. Nobody plans long-term. Now, American Jewry has their own mess, don't get me wrong. And if I said to do that, and I said you need to combine all the efforts of ADL and Stand With Us and I don't know, whatever, 7 or 8 different little organizations that are working, and combine it all into a $1 billion program that would be designed over 20 years or 10 years, I can imagine all the political problems you'd have and people not willing to give up their power and everything else. But that's the only solution in my mind. You can't leave it to the Israelis. But you need to think about it on a long-term plan and not, all these Stand With Us and all those type of organizations are really great at pointing out a particular headline that is wrong and all that. But that's a problem, but it's not the heart of our problem. The heart of our problem is educating the fact that we have a right to exist in the Middle East long-term, where we are and why that is, and everything else sort of flows from that. Jerry Grossman. Okay, Jerry Grossman. Okay, Judith Catton.
Yeah, hi. Can you comment, please? Thank you for what you do, by the way. Can you please comment on the attack of the Iranian embassy in Syria?
Sure. I mean, comment. I don't know what I can comment. First, it's not the Iranian embassy. Let's make that very clear. It was a compound, and it was a separate building that was being used by their military forces. So let's not talk about the embassy. The embassy building itself was not.
It's been reported. Okay. Yeah.
The embassy building itself, it was a compound, but it was a side building that was being used for military purposes. So it's not the embassy. We took out a really important Iranian operative. Now, one of the big questions, Iran is not behind Hamas, but it's clearly behind Hezbollah. It's behind the Houthis. It's behind the Iraqis who are firing at us. The Syrians who are firing at us. So Iran has been the orchestrator of a lot of the attacks on us. So the answer is, what do we do about that? We don't want to attack Iran itself, A, because it's difficult, and B, because we're not really ready or want to go into an all-out war with Iran. So what you're trying to do is get rid of their operatives wherever you can in any which way you can. You also wanted to see, what was part of the purpose of this is also to see how effective we are, because the reality is we managed to strike a meeting of the heads of Iran's operation, not only in Syria and Lebanon, but all their underlings. I mean, it was a wipeout of a lot of the top leaders of their organizations, and soldiers can be replaced easily. These top leaders are not easy to replace. Would I have decided to do it? I don't know. I don't have all the intelligence to say whether I would have decided to do it. It's a risk. And it's a risk how they're going to respond. But one of the interesting things that we've seen consistently is our intelligence on what's going on in Lebanon, Syria, Iran seems much better than our intelligence of what's going on in Gaza. And we've managed to eliminate a lot more of the top people in Hezbollah than we've been able to do in Gaza. So that's another factor to keep in mind, and keeping them thinking and being afraid. And that's also a good thing at this point. We need to find a way of convincing Hezbollah to end this war. And that's part of the strategy, to make it more painful to them. Will it work? That's a different story. But that's the strategy, to make it more and more painful without starting a full-fledged war.
Seemed to me an odd time to be poking the bear, but
Bear was poked already. I mean, understand something. There are, cities the towns along the border have almost been destroyed. Parts of Kiryat Shmona, parts of Shlomi, a lot of the kibbutzim and moshavim have been heavily damaged, and the people don't live there at the moment. So, it's a bear that's been quite active. So I don't know whether to say that it's a bad time to poke the bear. It's the bear that's been being responsible for a lot of things. You can look the other way. You can say it's a bad time to poke the bear, but is there a good time to poke the bear? I don't know. It's a risk, clearly a risk. And like I said, no one asked me, so I don't know what intelligence everyone had and what they decided to do. But it's not something outside the realm of what, it's not the same as having an air attack on Tehran, let's say, or anything equivalent to that. So, okay. Jerry Grossman again is still showing.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, good. I just wanted to say it's unfortunate that it takes a tragedy of October 7th to unite the country. That's number one. Okay. So where do we go from here is going to be a very, very difficult situation. And I think that the first step is that you have to enlist the Haredim into the service or into some army, into national service, in order to create a cohesion within the society. So you don't have to rely just on tragedy in order to unite the country so we can go forward. As far as America is concerned, what's going on in Israel and the world is that things are becoming very dual. You're going to have the religious communities in America that are very happy in the ghetto, being halachic, and you're going to have the secular Jews in America who used to have Zionist sympathies. If you're not going to encourage Aliyah from the Americans in this country, it's going to be a major problem, because you're always going to have Messianic religious Jews going into Israel, but then you're going to be left in a situation of a vacuum where you're not going to have cohesion in the society once the war finally comes over. So I'm just saying we have to look at this transition that's going on. And the only optimistic note that I could say is that it's better to be a Jew still now than it was in 1945. Okay, and that's it. But I appreciate everybody's words of wisdom, and it's wonderful to hear your bird's eye view of the situation. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Well, certainly better than to be a Jew in 1941. 45 already was hope, but it depends on where in 45.
Okay, yeah.
Leaving aside that correction, look, Israel society has two main divides and a couple of subdivides. The issue of the Haredim is a major issue on multiple levels. On one level, why should my children have to fight? Why should my children have to risk dying while their children don't have to? One of the interesting encounters that have taken place in the last few months is an encounter between religious Zionist women and Haredi women. And that has had like this mixed result, because On one hand, the Haredi women, mothers, feel very guilty. Here's this religious Zionist woman may have lost her son potentially in the war, and she doesn't have to, feel very guilty. Her son is safe in the yeshiva studying. So on one hand, it has that effect of making her feel guilty. On the other hand, she feels kind of happy her son is safe in the yeshiva. So it's not easy. It's a problem that exists that needs to be solved because it's not possible for part of the country to risk their lives and the other part of the country not to risk their lives. There's also the economic problem. We cannot continue with, if the Haredim was still 3% of the population and not growing, they could live forever and no one would care. But if there are now 15% and growing, and amongst the young people, there are a higher percentage, economically, it just doesn't work going forward. And we need to find solutions. They need to be integrated. But, any progress that we've made with the Haredi population at large has not been made with their rabbis. And their rabbis determine their lives. So that's really a difficult challenge. You brought up Aliyah. It's a difficult issue. It always has been. I'm one of these people who believe, in theory, every Jew should make Aliyah and move to Israel. But between the theory and reality, it's a whole other world, obviously. And there are all sorts of complications and difficulties and everything else. So I wish it would happen, but I don't see it happening unless, again, if the anti-Semitism gets even worse here, then all bets are off. And I do think anti-Semitism is going to get worse when you have anti-Semitism coming both from the right and the left simultaneously. That's a big challenge. And, whatever happens, let's put it this way. If Trump gets elected, you'll have even more from the right and from the left. So it's not a good situation, however you want to look at it. Maybe he won't be elected again. We'll see, I guess, in a few months. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. If there is nobody else, then I will thank everyone for coming. I will say we will be back in 2 weeks, this time from Israel again. And let's hope for some good news. There hasn't been, overall, it's been 6 months of bad news, terrible news, bad news, a few days of good news that came in the middle. Let's hope for some good news somewhere along the line. So thank you all. Have a great week.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. You're doing a wonderful job. Thank you.